Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everybody, for coming to the talk. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I'll talk about the dynamics of collaboration in open source between individuals, companies, and communities before moving on and talking about contribution strategies and plans. And then the last section will have some tips that you can use to become a good corporate citizen. We'll wrap it up with links to resources and a few final thoughts. I feel like Colin sort of introduced me. I have been in the technology industry for well over 20 years, working mostly on open source projects from within companies like Intel, Puppet, a few others. I am responsible for open source community strategy within VMware. I have a PhD where I focused on Linux kernel collaboration, amongst the other things that Colin already mentioned. But before we dive into talking about your company and your employees and how they should collaborate in open source projects, let's talk just a little bit about how collaboration works within open source projects and the complex interactions that exist between individuals, companies, and communities. There are a few exceptions, but contributions to most open source projects are centered around the individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies. And in a lot of cases, you don't even know where that person works when they make that contribution. To make this even more complicated for companies, in most open source projects, the leadership positions stay with the individual if that person changes jobs. So this means that an employee can take their leadership position in a project right with them to their next job. So companies are well served to make sure that these people are happy and maybe well compensated. In most projects, there really is no direct way for companies to participate other than dedicating time from individual employees who contribute then on behalf of the company, which is very common. At VMware, we have people working full-time on projects like Spring, RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, and a bunch of others. And if you aren't sure how to contribute as a company, you might actually be able to hire an existing contributor or possibly even a maintainer or leader in a project as an employee to do the work on the project on your behalf. But in addition to devoting time from your employees, companies are also in a position to help open source projects by providing additional resources like funding, infrastructure, legal representation, sponsorships for events. And I'll talk more about all of this later. Open source communities include a really wide variety of individuals who are working together within open source projects. Many of these people contribute on their free time. Others contribute as part of their employment at a company, like I do with VMware. And both are important. And all of these people are working together to accomplish a common goal as a community and to deliver on an open source project. And it's important to remember that the community or project needs have to come first. If your company has something specific that you want to contribute to an open source project, it's only going to work if it's also something that the project and the community actually wants. Individuals and companies can't force a project to take a contribution that goes against the needs of the project or isn't in the best interests of the community. It's better to find ways for your needs to align with the needs of the project. And it's important to make sure that managers and leaders within your company understand this dynamic and that they're supporting the needs of the community when they're making contributions. In open source communities, I've also had loads of small world moments where people I've worked with in past projects pop up again in other communities that I'm part of. So be thoughtful and kind when working with others within these communities, because if you're a big jerk, people are going to remember that and bring that right with them and tell everybody in this new community that you're participating in, which reflects badly on you as an individual and reflects badly on the company that you're representing as an employee. And as a company, it's important to think about that before you hire someone to do some work in an open source project on your behalf. Part of the role of the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, if you happen to have one, can be to help everyone navigate balancing these dynamics through education and best practices, The various groups within your organization really need to understand that they can't just push features into open source projects unless it's also something that benefits the community and the project as a whole. When companies try to do this, it puts individuals in a no-win situation that can impact employee satisfaction and retention. In this no-win situation, the employee cannot meet the needs of the community without jeopardizing their employment at your company. And you don't want to put people into this situation. I've left companies over this in the past. But by making sure that managers and leaders understand this dynamic, you can make sure that your individual contributors are doing work that your organization needs, that meets your objectives, while also being good corporate citizens within the community. Okay, now that we have a better idea of how collaboration works, let's talk about building a contribution strategy and plans for participating in open source. Having a solid open source strategy and plans are part of being a good corporate citizen, because successful participation in open source requires a long-term commitment. The individuals and companies that we just talked about, they spend months and years building trust and reputations within specific open source communities. And all of that hard work is for nothing if those people keep getting pulled off the open source projects to work on other things at your company. So in this section, I'll talk about how to build strategies and plans that support your business goals so that you can justify continuing to do this work over the long term. The most important part of putting together strategies and plans for your open source contributions is aligning them with the overall business goals for your company. If your open source engagements don't support the overall strategies for your organization, you will drastically reduce the chance of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure you support the overall corporate strategy, then it's much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. And when they're not clearly aligned, people will look at your open source participation as something that can be cut or starved of resources until it goes away on its own. And this also helps you make the case to senior management and company executives who aren't involved in the low-level details. Explaining how your open source contributions support the goals of the company can help the exec team understand the importance of this work. For many of us, our organizations use so many open source projects that it's really easy to get distracted and not know where to focus. It can help to think about which open source projects are strategic in some way for your company. At VMware, I curate a list of the most strategic projects across the entire company, and we work closely with our various business units to make sure we've got the right projects on that list. And those projects get more attention from our open source program office, from my team, from a community strategy perspective. And we collaborate with the project owners and the stakeholders to do high-level health assessments and suggest improvements. We also help make connections between product strategies and open source contributions to help contributors from different business units work together and understand why a particular project is important to each of them, to avoid contributors accidentally doing something that causes issues for another team within the company. And for everything else, we focus on scalable efforts using best practice guides, automation, Slack channel for general open source Q&A, training, meetups, presentations, anything else we can think of to help our employees do the right thing in open source in a way that scales across the hundreds and thousands of projects that we're involved in. And then after you've decided which projects to support, you need to figure out how to find people who can contribute. Again, companies contribute to open source projects by having employees participate and collaborate in those projects. In some cases, you might have employees already with the skills required to do this. But the thing to keep in mind is that contributing to open source projects requires different skills than participating in internal projects. These people need to be really comfortable in very ambiguous environments where they'll receive feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and be expected to respond to this feedback in the public. in a professional manner. And keep in mind that not every engineer wants their work to be in the public spotlight, which can feel a bit like being under a microscope sometimes. And if you don't have the skills internally, you might be able to find some existing contributors that you can hire. But you need to be a little bit careful about that because you don't want to get a reputation within a community for aggressively poaching employees from other companies. So you may need to be a little bit subtle about it and let people know that you're open to hiring people who work in this community without aggressively trying to hire them away from other companies. If you make it easy for your employees to contribute, your employees are more likely to reduce technical debt by contributing patches, bug fixes, new features back into the upstream projects where they belong. If you have too many controls and strict processes, you're probably making it a lot harder for your teams to do their work. You should think about whether your guidelines or processes help people engage in open source projects in ways that work well for your organization. While you do need to provide guidance about things like licensing, avoiding disclosure of confidential information, and any internal review processes you might have, this can be done in a more educational way. And my caution about guidelines and processes is that sometimes they can be written in ways that really discourage contributions, especially when they use very heavy, scary legal jargon with an emphasis on how you're going to punish someone if they accidentally do something wrong. So you're better off writing the guidelines in ways that help engineers understand what you need them to do and why, in language that those engineers can actually understand. At VMware, we have a robust set of open source guidelines, and we have a really lightweight approval process for people to contribute to open source projects so that we can help them actually make those contributions, but we do have some controls in place. Now, as with any good strategy and plans, the outcome and results should be measurable so that you can tell whether your efforts were successful. Now, I love data. Measuring project health and success is kind of a hobby for me, and it's something I'm pretty passionate about, so I get a lot of questions on this topic. And usually the questions are focused on how to decide what to measure, and that's kind of the wrong approach, and it depends. What you measure depends on what you're trying to achieve, which is why this slide is in the strategy and planning section. Ultimately, you need to look at your strategies and plans and come up with the criteria that will help you measure whether or not you're successful. For example, if you want to improve the performance of a particular piece of open source software, measuring numbers of commits is not going to get you there. You have to actually measure the performance of that thing you're trying to improve. And then once you figure out the criteria, you can get the data required to measure it, and there are loads of tools available to do this. Some of them are in the Chaos project, which is linked on the slide. And then, maybe gather some extra data so that you can investigate other ideas for how you might want to participate in the project in the future. Now that we've figured out what to do, let's talk about how to do it while being a good corporate citizen and avoid some common but embarrassing mistakes. Each project is different, and what you need to do within the community will vary. So you want to have a close look at things like the project documentation, the contribution guides, and spend whatever time it takes to fully understand those guidelines. And the expectations for contributors are really different for each project. So don't assume you know how to contribute, even if you've contributed to loads of other open source projects in the past. I strongly recommend taking some time to lurk in the community and understand how people participate. I have seen so many overeager new community members sort of jump into the community with both feet. They make a whole bunch of mistakes. They violate community norms. They talk about things that aren't relevant. And they generally kind of make a mess of things. And everybody makes mistakes at some point, but so many of them can be avoided by just taking some time to learn about the community first, rather than barging in and trying to be an active participant on the first day. When you've spent some time understanding the expectations, you should start with something small. I've seen companies spend a ton of time working on huge new features internally, and then they sort of dump them into the community as one massive contribution that no one was expecting and didn't want in the first place. And so that's just a waste of time, right, for everybody involved. So I encourage you to start out with some small things, like maybe some bug fixes, learn about the contribution process, and talk about those new features before you actually make them. Once you start participating, you will get feedback. Sometimes this feedback will be kind, other times it will not be. And as much as you might want to just fire back at people, this is going to reflect badly on you as an individual and on your employer. So it's better in the long run to maybe wait to respond until you can cool off just a little bit. And even when the feedback's harsh, there will be things you need to do to rework your contribution to make it acceptable. So you should try to focus on the changes that you need to make in your contribution. And in some cases, you might need to have hard discussions with people about these. And this can be an incredibly difficult line to walk sometimes, but staying professional and being kind to other people while responding to difficult feedback can make a big difference to your personal reputation and the reputation of your employer within open source communities. And you should expect to iterate on this feedback. After you submit your changes to accommodate the first wave of feedback, you'll likely get more feedback on those changes. So consider it an iterative process that will take some time. Submitting something at the last minute before, say, a release window closes and expecting it to be included is going to be frustrating for everybody. So just make sure you give yourself some extra time. Now, after you get past those first few small contributions, you want to make sure that you actually spend time discussing proposed changes in the community before you start making them. By talking about contributions very early in the process, you can get feedback on ways to architect those changes so that they'll be consistent with the expectations of the project. You'll also learn about anybody else who might be working in similar areas to avoid conflicting changes that won't work together when they're merged into the project. And these discussions avoid surprising people, especially for new features or other really big changes. It can help to break those big changes into several smaller, easier to digest contributions. It is so much easier for maintainers to provide feedback on small contributions. And it gives you time to make corrections if anything you were doing maybe wasn't quite right. And this allows you to iterate through several contributions, making it less likely to have big fundamental issues. It's also important to keep in mind that you do not have any control over the other people in the project. This is different from working within a company where you can escalate issues to managers who can work to resolve problems with, say, non-responsive employees. In open source projects, you don't have a strict chain of command or other ways to exert control over the people you collaborate with. So instead, you should strive to be kind and easy to work with, since you may need to find other ways to influence people to respond to your patches or pull requests. A lot of the work that we do in open source projects is based on the relationships that we have with other people. My PhD research was focused on collaboration in the Linux kernel, and as part of that research, I interviewed a bunch of kernel developers. And in all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. And they mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences and meetings as something that was really important. They talked about how it's sometimes easier to work through really big, difficult issues at conferences. And it's easier to communicate with someone online after you've met them before and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a nice conversation with them at an event. Knowing the human being on the other side of that keyboard can make a bigger difference than what you might realize. And if your employees are working in open source projects, then you should see if there are any conferences where large numbers of other community members attend. By having some key employees attend those conferences, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with others that will benefit your company and your employees. I've spent a lot of time at open source conferences over the years, and I have deep and lasting connections with those people that I met at those events. And now, when I need to do something new, or maybe I have a question about something, I usually know somebody who can point me in the right direction, and I often make introductions for other employees to people outside of the company who can help us learn something new or solve some tricky issue. Upstreaming your patches helps you become a good corporate citizen, but it also has quite a few internal benefits for your company. When you maintain patches internally, every time the open source project releases fixes or other updates, you need to go through the work of reapplying your patches. and possibly even rewriting some of them if they touched bits of the code that were updated. Now, the side effect of this sometimes difficult process is that when people, when they tend to avoid applying updates, this can be a big problem if those updates contain security fixes, which they probably do. And while it takes more time up front, you are better off taking the time to submit those patches back into the open source project where they can be properly maintained as part of the project and where other people can benefit from them. And the easier you make this for employees to contribute those changes back into open source projects, the better off you'll be. Understanding maintenance expectations is also a big part of being a good corporate citizen. Putting large chunks of code into an open source project, disappearing and expecting someone else to maintain it, reflects poorly on your organization. Now, if you make minor changes, small bug fix, someone else is responsible for maintaining that, so you won't be on the hook for those. But where you really need to think about this is if you're making very large contributions, like a new feature, or in the case of the kernel, a new driver. And you need to make sure that your employees are planning to maintain that code over the long term before you contribute it into an open source project. If you want to open source one of your own projects because it has no users, it's old, it's crusty, and you don't want to maintain it anymore, please don't do that. Dumping your project into the open source community and hoping that someone else will be just dying to take it over is a wee bit naive and generally makes your company look bad. So make sure that you're open sourcing a project for the right reasons. For example, a desire to collaborate with other people and innovate on your project is a good reason to open source it. And your company needs to be prepared to maintain it over the long term, just like you would with something you released under a proprietary license. This will take time and resources, so it's important to plan for that. Before I wrap up this talk, let me leave you with a few resources that you might find useful. The To-Do group has a bunch of guides that have great info about all aspects of how companies work with open source projects. The CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group has a governance working group, a contributor growth working group, a mentoring working group, and we provide templates and guidance for CNCF projects about contributor experience, sustainability, governance, and openness to help people develop strategies for maintaining healthy projects. The Open Source Way guidebook has loads of details about building and maintaining open source projects, and these are all great starting places for understanding best practices for open source projects. The work that we do within open source communities is in the public, and it's highly visible. Other contributors and the press will talk about our behavior and our participation, which can reflect positively or negatively on our organization's brand. By being a good corporate citizen within open source projects, we can help make sure that our participation has a positive impact on our company's brand. With that, thank you for coming to my talk. And do we have time for questions, or should we move to the next panel?